States for the local citizens, and therefore increase poverty and harm the local population. But as any undergraduate economic student learn, the selection of which you import and export is much more complicated than the issue of tariffs. So that you teach years ago, I used to teach undergraduate international economics and international trade. So you look at a poor country like Lesotho that got this 50% tariff. It was because they happened to develop clothing export industry through AGOA to have tax-free access to the American economy. And they didn't have enough money to actually import US goods. So you're actually were running a big trade surplus. And in essence, what happened is you were punishing Lesotho because of their poverty and because they took advantage of the regulation the United States itself set. It was madness to impose this 50% tariff. From a macroeconomic perspective, the US trade deficit is linked to a very large government deficit, which contributes to US consuming more it's producing. On top of that, as we'll talk about, the US, and you've probably heard about it already, has a hegemonic currency, which is this great privilege, because people are willing to hold dollars and dollar-denominated debt in exchange for goods, which has allowed the United States to run this massive system where it basically consumes more than it produces. Despite the absolute nonsense from Trump's mouth, tariffs are a tax on the US population. You know that recently we retracted the number on foodstuffs because it was raising the price for some of these MAGA supporters. Nobody can predict what will ultimately to the underlying macroeconomics, but tariffs, we know, and despite what we've been talking to the classes, are a very useful tool for industrial policy when they're industry specific, carefully calculated with an understanding of the consequences to production, time limited, and is supported like a lot of other measures like subsidies. We know this goes all the way back to the early part of American industrialization when Alexander Hamilton saw the importance of tariffs and subsidization for building the industrialization of the United States. But basically, the pretense that there was some kind of economic logic and formula underlying tariff has quickly disappeared. We know what happened is the United States turned around on August 6th and imposed a 40% tariff on Brazil. Not because of the trade relations, but because Trump didn't like what was happening to the former dictator, Bolsonaro, and because of the former president basically being in prison. Because it was a direct attack on the rule of law, they argued, but in reality, what it was enforcement of the rule of law, or he was in prison for a scenario for actually trying to overturn an election. Something we know was too close to what Trump himself did, in the United States following the 2020 elections. So that, okay. Je pense vite, excuse-moi. So tariffs were basically then imposed to try to reverse this position of the imprisonment of Bolsonaro. So we know also that tariffs were not imposed on a lot of crucial products, so it didn't directly affect Brazil as much as it would. But overall, tariff-free imports from Brazil stayed around 26%. And it was a madness for a while putting tariffs on products that the United States doesn't produce, such as coffee. So how do we understand the goals of Trump's tariffs? Eric Weiner, well-known political economist, I'm a visiting professor this year at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, had a paper on which he presented on November 17 called "What Kind of Mercantilist is Trump?" Trump basically has stated multiple goals in his promotion of tariffs. That includes things like developmental, positive impact on supposedly on certain industries, revenue generations, and attempts to negotiate more trade relationships to try to get countries to lower the deficits. So the problem is these are all in heavy contradiction. So if you're going to negotiate to get rid of your tariffs, how's that going to create revenue generation? If you're going to negotiate to get rid of the tariffs, how's that going to have an impact on your industries? And so it's a real problem of, once again, lies, misconceptions, misdiagnosis, and contradictions on things coming out of Trump's mouth. He also reminded us of a very important role of tariffs in the history of world relationships. We go back to the period of just after the Chinese Opium Wars. Chinese set up a system of tariffs, which is aimed at a tributary system, trying to get countries to create obeisance, to create subordination, to pay off Trump and his friends, basically to line his own personal coffers. And so it was kind of a tribute system. You pressure people to behave in a way in which you then are subservient to those tariffs. The problem is that it's a bit hard to reconcile a kind of tributary approach when you give up a lot of the mechanisms of pressure on Africa and other countries through a massive cut in USAID. And so the numbers, and also, of course, getting rid of the gold. So if you wanted to get African countries to bow down to you, to be to act in the tributary system, you want to use all of the leverage you have, not walk away from aid and walk away from the AGOA, the advantages of exporting the U.S. markets. According to the New York Times, by June 22nd, USA dropped 6,256 programs and 120 billion from the January 2015, with a very tiny amount, with a huge impact on aid to Africa and key areas like maternal health, diseases, emerging diseases, TB, HIV/AIDS, with big cuts in these programs that affected Africa by 60 to 89%. Very few countries have avoided more than a 50% decline. And we actually look at the figures, the most recent figures, you see a huge decline of 75% of USAID. I'll show you that in a second. A cut really of 75% of aid to Africa through the end of October this year. And so it's been a huge cut. I mean, there has been this growth of U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, where they're actually helping U.S. corporations to empower themselves. But the budget is very tiny in comparison to the aid budget. So if you look at the data, I won't spend a lot of time on U.S. foreign assistance, that basically 2024, it was at roughly 17.3 billion given to sub-Saharan Africa. And by the latest figures through November, it's down to 4.3 billion. So it's still 22% of all aid, but a massive cut, as you see, from 17 to around 4.3 billion in aid. So what has happened to the tariffs? On July 7th, Trump extended the deadline of the imposition of tariffs on Executive Order 14257 on April 2nd until August 1st. On August 7th, he imposed the following tariff rates on sub-Saharan African countries. And you can see the rates are between 15%. Vast majority of countries still get 10%, and this is the rates above 10% to African countries between 15 and 30%. The highest being hit is Algeria, basically Libya, South Africa, Tunisia, all 25 to 30 some odd percent rates of tariffs. Now, Trump argued tariffs would bring countries to the negotiating table, but no African country has really reached a trade agreement with the U.S. There was an existing historical one with Morocco, and there's some discussions with Kenya. In part, this is because there's little for them to offer. African countries don't have much to offer to try to get the tariffs reduced. It still is having a significant impact in some industries. South Africa has seen a massive impact on its automobile industry, which is the second, U.S. is the second largest trading partner after China. South Africa shipped 1.9 billion worth of vehicles to the U.S. market in 2024, accounting for 16.5%. So there's been a dramatic decline of it. Exports have plummeted by 60% from South Africa, with a risk of losing up to 100,000 jobs. Situation is worse in Lesotho, which ranks among the poorest nations in the country, youth joblessness at 48%. So the government has declared a state of disaster. Russian U.S. tariffs will devastate the textile and apparel industry, which employs 40,000 people in Lesotho, basically. And what we've seen already accounts for 20% of GDP. We've already seen in November 1st a decline of 30% of the labor force. as it no longer has access to tax-free low going. So it is having an impact on African countries. They have to monitor overall, and particularly more problematic on the manufacturing side. So I want to switch now slightly, talk about trade in the context of finance and finance more generally. So if you look at the main source of where the caves come from, it comes from this kind of weird economist Scott Moran, who was chief of the economic, head of the Council of Economic Advisors, become a member of the Federal Reserve Board for the governors, and who makes the argument tariffs provide revenue and offsets by currency adjustments, present minimal inflation, otherwise reversible effects consistent with the experience. So it makes the argument that actually Trump picked up as, well, tariffs are not inflationary, which is of course completely nonsensical. Has a real impact on people's consumption and the budgets of the United States. And then makes the argument somehow you can do the currency adjustments. But he makes an argument which is even more significant. He argues that the root of the economic imbalance lies in persistent dollar overvaluation that prevents the balancing of international trade. And this overvaluation is driven by the inelastic demand for reserve assets. So they started talking about somehow even charging taxes and holding American dollars reserve. As the global GDP grows, it becomes increasingly burdensome for the United States to finance the position of reserve assets with umbrella as the manufacturing critical sectors bear the brunt of the costs. So what would the US be doing if they undercut their role, the key role as their reserve currency? What's Trump's position on this? How important is the financial system and dollar hegemony to understanding the current structure of African economies and the current deficit? Let me focus the rest of the talk on what I have, fleeting time, on the issue of currencies, finance, financial flows, and its pertinence to African development. So why financial flows? What are they? Briefly, for those maybe less familiar, international financial flows are both private and official. Official flows incorporate concessional assistance and non-concessional flows to developing countries, export credits, which primarily have a commercial motive. Private flows basically are also defined as financial flows at market terms financed out of private sector resources and private grants. Private capital flows can be divided into foreign direct investment, portfolio equity, remittances, and private sector borrowing. So financial flows and understanding financial flows are really crucial for understanding how Africa connects to the rest of the world. Though you have goods and people moving, basically, it's often the financial flows associated with their movements, which are really important in understanding the nature of African economies and how it intersects with the global economy. In my view, basically, what is crucial and what has shaped the economic structure of the continent, including extreme disarticulation since 1980, when constraints on flows were largely demobilized. All financial flows are denominated in currencies. They involve currency exchanges, and hence understanding the nature of currencies and their institutional power is really salient for comparing the global economic dominance of subservience. What's really central here is really understanding hegemony through currencies in the financial system and subservient as a result of that lack of empowerment in the financial system. And understanding that relationship between Africa and the rest of the world is really crucial in understanding how Africa interacts with the rest of the world and how debt has been created as a mechanism of subservience in Africa. So the key characteristic of a global economy and the global financial exercise is really a hierarchy of currencies. Roughly speaking, there are 5 levels of currencies in the world: the hegemonic currency, the US dollar, the major strong currencies like the yen and the euro, the minor strong currency like the renminbi and the Mexican peso, weak currency like the Argentine peso, and then what we call junk currencies, like many African currencies. Understanding the power relationships and configurations in global financial architecture is really a key to understanding what we have yet is another neoliberal culture. Dollar hegemony, for those that have a bit of a history, was built into the design of Bretton Woods, institutionalized as global currency as a store of value, unit account, standard preferred payment, and means of payment. U.S. took full advantage of the system. They didn't play by the rules. Hypothetically, you were supposed to have, for every dollar you released, you're supposed to have the equivalent of gold in Fort Knox at a rate of $35 per ounce. The U.S. didn't do it. It flooded the world with dollars in support of expansion of U.S. corporations and in support of the Vietnam War. The ratio of dollars to gold reserves at $35 per ounce went 4 to 1 in the 1950s to 1 to 4. So you only had a dollar's worth of gold at $35 per ounce at Fort Knox by 1971, and it led to the, as we know, the very, very famous prediction by De Gaulle, demanding gold. He said, "I'm sitting with all these dollars, give me gold." And the U.S. and Nixon said, "Go to hell, you're not getting our gold." And that led to the end of the Bretton Woods system. It came directly out of the abuse by the United States and its failure to actually then to adhere to the system being having gold available in the transactions. 70 to 81 to 81 was considerable stress. People like one of the founders of neoliberalism, Bergson, argued that it was the end of the dollar hegemony because of the massive deficits. But in fact, there was a period of tectonic shift where dollar hegemony was solvent and reconstructed from one based on industrial strength in the United States and trade surpluses to one where the US became the center of global capitalism. a series of steps were really undertaken to reconstruct dollar hegemony after the Bretton Woods system. Following the revoking convertibility, foreign banks started to purchase T-bills instead of gold, which effectively provided finance for the U.S. the growing very large U.S. deficits, including the U.S. military ventures abroad. The U.S. issued debt in its own currency, where it could not default unless it chose to. The unwillingness to hold bonds could lead to a rise in interest rates, could lead to a fall in the value of the currency, but neither would threaten the hegemony of the US dollar, which was now very much locked in place. In '74, the Saudis basically agreed to actually then do all of its expenditures in dollars with oil production, and that anointed and brought the US dollar as your main mechanism of the creation of the price of commodities in the world, and hence dollars were needed in all these international commodity markets. Petrodollars, of course, petrodollars were then deposited in the United States. They were there reinvested, reled to Latin America, and led, of course, to the crisis in the late '70s, as the US dollar became a debt service and standard for payment. There was also the freeing up of the Eurodollar markets. Thatcher also abolishing exchange controls, allowing people to hold foreign exchange denominated in assets. High interest rates by the Volcker period led to a situation where the United States became very attractive to inflows of capital, low taxation, deregulation, pressure labor policies to reduce wages, all attracted dollars to the US. Neoliberal policies also aimed at shifting income from labor to capital in favor of finance capital. And so you had the monetary policy encouraging asset inflation, drawing finance capital into the country. And then what happened is you opened up the world to the flows of US dollars and capital through neoliberalism. You increase global trade, you open up countries to FDI, you created new value chain systems, you generated global production networks through the value chain, and you push manufacturing offshore, putting further pressure in the United States on wages, and the wage share making more capital, more attractive for capital to come in. So the rise in global health, as we've seen a massive increase in concentration of wealth over this period, it fed financialization and the holding of that wealth in US dollars. And so what happened then was the multiplicity of roles and functions of the US were really enhanced after 1980, creating continuity of dollar domination. We can see that even today, if we look at the period 2000-2020, US dollar share reserves, cross-border banking claims, banking liabilities, and current debt issuance relative to US shares of GFA all grew, were as high as 2.6 to 2.75 from 2015 on. We see some transformation since then. You begin to see a bit of a decline, particularly after 2015 to 2020. And we see the decline of US dollars in reserve, basically, and then a rise in gold reserves more recently. But I want to make it very clear, again, I have a lot of detail and a lot of graphs, and I'll make the PowerPoint available to you as a resource. But basically, central bank reserves dropped from 71% in 1999. Most recently, in mid-2025, it has declined to 56.3%. But the main thing is not because the US dollar is being exchanged and removed as a reserve currency. It's not that it's being replaced by other currency, it's because of the rise in the price of gold and the purchase of gold in reserves. So the share of foreign ownership of T-bills has fallen to 30% from the peak of 50%, but it's really been this rise in gold. There has been some decline in the role of, if you use a Z-score, a Z-score for US shares together with GDP, it has recently been in the -1 to -2 level. And there has been a rise at the same time, there's also, we see a rise in dollar deposits. There's a lot of banking systems allow individuals to hold dollars, and we see a significant rise, the highest in Latin America, the dollar deposits are 19.1% of total bank deposits. So as you're getting some erosion of some types of holding the dollars, you have a rise in other forms of holding the dollars to some degree of countering. So it could be defined in the hegemonic position of the US. So why does this matter? Why do we talk about this? Basically, the depiction really provides is an understanding of the transformation of hegemonic position of the dollar. But we need to really understand the bottom side. What's going on in this global system where Africa is? Where's the position in terms of the lower end of the currency? And what is the implications? So the US then obviously the top free from balance of payments constraint after then Bretton Woods, and hence the macroeconomic policy priorities, basically, which is not impeded by external consequences. We know here in Africa it doesn't work like that. The US has massive seigniorage, which allows the US to gain economic resources from foreigners who are holding trillions of US dollars at costlessness. So it does lead to lower interest rates, as we talked about, reduces the constraint on the US military. And we know that, we know in the Saudi case, they're happy to actually get, you have this royal family of concentration of wealth, not a terribly democratic system, but in return for denominating the currency in dollar, the US gave the House of Saud huge amount of military support. Even to this moment, with the recent signing between the leader of Saudi Arabia and getting access to the most modern military for the United States. But the flip side of hegemony is subordination. Understanding the dynamics of hegemony and subordination is the issue of power, which is both an input and output, with key components of military, economic, and political. The exercise of state power is paramount at the core of the system. Currency is obviously state issued, and the standing of your currency in the global system is both a product of actions and reactions to the exercise of power of other states. Power is relative. The rise of power as a result of these mechanisms and changes in dollar hegemony diminishes the power of the rest of the world, exacerbating subordination. Economic power is key to determining which country's currency is weakly hegemonic. The size of the country's economic economy is important, but other dimensions are important, like technological advantage and associated productivity. And so we know there was that it's not sufficient, since the US really has both attributes during the interwar period. So there has to also have to be a role in the willingness of the United States to take on the role of not isolationism, but political hegemony as well, and military hegemony. And so these are key elements which have put the United States at the center of power. What was also really crucial in understanding a hegemonic system was having international agencies and associations feeding into that power structure. So the US became the leader of the neoliberal order, and also worked through the operation of the IMF, World Bank, GATT, and WTO, as well as NATO. And there are also leaders in education and culture, everybody listening to American music, watching American films, etc. And this was also important in building the hegemonic position of the United States. And in some senses then, what was really instrumental was the central role of the World Trade Organization in enhancing and creating, in some cases, the absurdity of a 20-year level of protection on property rights, which was introduced through the WTO agreement in 1995. And so the power dynamics underlying the strength, military, economic, and political, are important to feed into it. But at the same time, that power arrangement creates the opposite, which is domination, inferiority, and subjugation. So the impact of the US neoliberal policies basically strengthened dollar hegemony, at the same time weakened the position of African economies, and created a much greater dependence on commodity exports with its cycle of boom and bust. I wrote back in an article I wrote way back in the early part of my career in 1992, which predicted that structural adjustment would deindustrialize Africa. But it has. I won't have time to go through that. It's a whole separate lecture. But a key element in that creation of increasing reliance on dependency of commodity exports is the International Monetary Fund, which has fed into the mechanism and dynamic of the global hierarchy of currencies. Let me talk a bit about US hegemony and the utilization of the IMF, which has been so omnipresent in Africa in the post-independence period, and very central, as I've written in a book in 2008, really central along with the World Bank, and institutionalizing neoliberal policies through structural adjustment on the African continent. So the U.S. has always maintained its position as into the International Monetary Fund. You basically have to, for any significant change in the IMF, you have to have 85%. Well, the United States has always had veto power because it has always had greater than 15% in the voting power. So it's always had the ability to stop any transformation of the nature and role of the International Monetary Fund. The fund, I don't want to spend a lot of time, I don't have so much time, but yeah, you historically had a situation where the IMF was set up to set up a Bretton Woods system, basically through a quota system. I don't really have the time to do it here, but what you had in that is it was in the acceptance of the policy mechanism, which eventually became the Pollack Method, which really heavily emphasized a very anti-inflationary bias and really pro-cyclical policies. So it didn't matter whether the economy was in recession, it still used the same pro-cyclical elements of intervention to actually always reduce levels of deficits and increase constraints on monetary policy, often raising levels of interest rates and cutbacks in money expansion, because it always had a bias of thinking a real problem was anti-inflationary and was always caused by poor government policies. And so this was a system that was put in place back when they had the Bretton Woods system. But today, to this very moment, we actually have a situation in which even the latest interventions on bailouts in Africa and elsewhere, it's the same neoliberal policies of deregulation, the pushing of independence of central banks, the policies of macro stabilization, pushing economies into greater dependence on commodity exports in the cycle of boom, and to pushing these commodities without the capacity to intervene in a kind of fiscal policy counter-cyclical intervention. So when the African economies get into a crisis, they're pushed into a worse crisis by these pro-cyclical policies. And basically, that has not changed for this moment. And the whole idea, of course, is that in some senses, you increase the recession, in the process you cut back on your imports and demand for imports, and that somehow is going to balance out the position fiscally in international currency and stabilize the currency. And so the same system, very flawed model, has been put in place in one country after the next, and never addresses the underlying real causes of the structural nature, which has led to the series of debt crises. And so we have a situation now where the IMF is always with the system sitting ready to impose pro-cyclical policy in African countries. And so African countries, during the booms of the commodity export era, they try to raise the reserves so that when the inevitable decline in prices of commodities go down, which is the real source of the crisis that occurs in Africa, and they can no longer support the debt, they build up reserves to kind of maintain that existing capacity to avoid the IMF international system and the punishing policies that are put in place. And it's created what I call a vicious cycle of commodity dependence. Meaning what has transpired is that governments in good times build up their reserves. In the process, it helps the hegemony of the United States dollar, because you're then holding US dollars in reserve in US Treasury bills. And instead of utilizing that hard currency to import the kind of commodities like capital goods to transform your economies away from commodity dependence, you hold the reserves for the bad times. But inevitably, as we know, this latest crisis that came about in 2019, 2020, the reserves are not enough. You inevitably lower your reserves because you get into a massive decline in your ability to export because of the decline in commodities prices. And your debt begins to rise, you begin to borrow over this period of time. Also, as we see, trying to gain access to sovereign debt, which allows you then to avoid the IMF as well. But inevitably, you get a situation where you do have a growing increase of the need to service your debt in hard currency, and inevitably your reserves run out. So every time you've had a commodity boom, where you can utilize that foreign exchange and maybe begin to transform your economy, you instead put it in reserve for the bad day, for the rainy day. And inevitably it leads to a vicious cycle of commodity dependence. So you then continue to rely on commodity dependence even though you need to get out of the commodity dependence, which is inevitably going to lead to the rise and fall of your economy and inevitably lead to another debt crisis. I've been coming to Africa since 1980, and I've seen multiple debt crises always returning because it's the nature of this global financial system and the nature of the African structures, which has created this disarticulation where African economies still don't produce what they consume. They simply then, vast majority of the goods which are then exported out of the country. And it creates a system of financial subordination. At the same time, holding vast amount of government's reserves feeds into dollar hegemony with the enormous economic, financial, and military advantage. I once had a huge argument some years ago with the head of the central bank in Nigeria, arguing why you're holding $40 billion of reserve in US treasuries when the United States is fighting a stupid war in Iraq. You're financing, and it got me in big trouble. He had some guards with some guns that the guy almost got shot. But in any case, nothing has changed in African economies. Basically, the Stoic approach feeds into and buttresses the system of subordination. And so the gross asymmetries embedded in the financial system reduces policy space, constrains sovereignty, and shapes the social, political, and economic structures of African economies. The vagaries, then, as we know, of the boom and bust cycle inevitably puts Africa back into a crisis and into the arms of the IMF. I won't go through this table, which I have, which goes through the IMF resource and disbursements for 1998. But let me summarize. I don't know what's happened here today. You quick catch up. How much? 10 minutes? Okay, I'll do my best. So let me summarize the bottom line. Just to point to the role of IMF, COVID, and its aftermath, the number of African countries accessing PRGT, the poverty reduction growth funding trust loans, is only 12 in 2014. Basically, between around 2020-2021, the number had grown back up to 39 sub-Saharan African countries. Number before that, the 1980 global crisis. So we now see the highest number in history, with 39 sub-Saharan African countries actually then accessing the funds from the International Monetary Fund. This creation of this new finance, resilience, sustainability trust to help countries adjust to long-term threats. And so, if we look at the numbers, in 2019, sub-Saharan Africa had borrowed $2 billion in outstanding credit from the general resource account of the International Monetary Fund, $3.9 billion from the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. By 2024, the number from GRA had doubled to $4.4 billion. PRGT was all the way up to $13.7 billion, in addition $1 billion from the RST. And so what we have then is a system in which, while the IMF was an attempt to really get out of reliance on the IMF, we actually had a very nice decline in the previous crisis, 2008. Inevitably, this global system feeds Africa back into the hands of the International Monetary Fund with very problematic consequences. So how do the other flows feed into subordination and drawing on Shiji calls for structural disarticulation due to structural production and consumption? I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I want to talk about, keep going to the personal remittances thing. Keep going. Keep going. Okay, stop. So what we have is the figures, interesting figures on financial flows. And what you have is you have a situation where if you look at the period of, and I look at remittances and FDI relative to ODA, overseas development system, and there you have a ratio which have a massive dependence in 1990 through 2000. So in 1990, the amount of remittance of FDI was only roughly 10% of the total amount of ODA. This was a period of maximum pressure through structural adjustment in Africa. You did not have access back to any other sources. All of foreign lending had private sources had basically dried up. Remittances were very small. FDI was small, and overwhelming in African countries had to go to bilateral and multilateral aid. And this was a period in which there was a massive utilization of the shrinkage of policy space to put the pressure on African governments to impose neoliberal policies. What is neoliberal policies? It's austerity, macro stabilization, deregulation, privatization, which dramatically transformed and really had a huge negative effect on the formal sector of economies in virtually every country. We see that it was a really an attempt. Part of it was a real decline of FDI, and then we see a resurgence in the movement away, so that by 2008, you had a massive increase of flows of people out of Africa, remittances. I've always talked about, sometimes you go to these meetings, they say, "Oh, isn't it wonderful Africa's getting all these remittances?" No, it's sad, because it means that so many of the great brains, the people that are well trained, have left the continent for other countries, and they play a role in sending money back to their families for survival. And that's a sad tragedy of the inability of African countries to create the environment and climate to employ the greatest minds, the greatest trained people that lead. And so it's a tragedy in some ways, but it's also become a huge source of financing, actually exceeding in some years the amount coming from ODA. It's quite a remarkable transformation. Also, massive growth in FDI. I'm not going to have time to spend on it, but FDI growth largely has been in resources. Huge increase after the Iraq War in the investment in oil and gas in Africa to alternative sources. And so this has been a big increase over the period of time, where ODA has really shrunk quite dramatically. So I won't have time to get through this in limited time. The other thing which is really growing is been a huge increase in the availability of sovereign debt. And so you can see, if you look at the figures, you had no HIPAC countries, no African countries really accessing debt for quite a long period of time until 2006, 2008. And we've seen the borrowing on sovereign debt markets grow dramatically as a new source of foreign exchange without the kind of neoliberal conditionality. So it's gone and peaked from around 2.5 billion in the 2006-8 period, all the way up to nearly 14 billion in 2018, with a total amount of lending of $73 billion. Huge increase in debt coming from the source. And we know during COVID it shrunk down dramatically, but then there's been a rise since then. Kenya taking on 1.5 billion at an interest rate of 10.3%. Benin 750 million, and the most recent 2005, Kenya 7-5-year bonds of 1.5. So a whole series of bond issues through 2024, 2005, with the payment of extremely high interest rates. You're paying massive increases. For 5 minutes? Okay. And what we've shown econometrically, some work I've done with basically Michael Alvisi, a Nigerian economist, we've shown econometrically that Africa has been overpaying relative to the basic fundamentals of supposedly driving these markets by 2.9%, and then 1% over the data. So they're overpaying billions of dollars to access these markets. Africa being punished for no other reason than discrimination against Africa. But it's also creating huge vulnerability. In the process, we can see that during it, to argue, a huge reliance on commodity exports. The levels during the colonial period, has over 90% of exports to sub-Saharan Africa in basically in primary commodities. Manufacturing being very tiny, as opposed to sub-Saharan other areas which have transformed. We can see the export structure in Southeast Asia. 84% is manufacturing, as opposed to 8%, 7% in sub-Saharan Africa. Huge reliance on commodity exports with rise in price. But I'm out of time. So let me just, by conclusion, come to the bottom line. Okay. So now we have sub-Saharan once again in a debt crisis. Debt to exports exceeded 200%, the level considered to be priced by the IMF, which we had not seen for 20 years. As of October 25th, the World Bank updates the accessibility for 23 countries in distress or with high risk for debt distress up to 2023. At the latest debt structure and see that bondholders all the way up to 20% of debt, China 11%. It's kind of a mix of various different sources, basically. But and now that a situation where increasing countries can no longer service the debt. Ghana with the default 2022, basically, in Zambia with the default 2020. 2023, Ethiopia defaulted, so did Niger, Eurobonds. Ghana is an interesting case because largely did everything in accordance with orthodoxy, and still didn't help. Listen, they don't really get orthodoxy, doesn't understand it's basically a structural problem. So if the rising growth star, they argued before the crisis, and beacon of hope in West Africa is gone. Well, gone as default, basically. Debt crisis really are symptoms of the deep malaise of the core of the national financial architecture of the 21st century capitalism, because you'll have to begin to move away from dollar hegemony toward greater national multipolarity. Okay. So we see what's going on. Well, one terrific paper by Colton Bruner that actually looks at case studies of saying, well, what are they doing in central banks? What are they doing in currency? Did a very kind of anthropological almost analysis of Uganda, Zambia, Ghana, and Kenya, which has full of near full capital account liberalization, which is not written on this. It's not the system predicted. Africa is supposed to get great advantages through capital liberalization, but it's been a disaster. It's likely huge amounts of capital outflows from the continent. In Uganda, 3 international banks control 90% of the foreign exchange markets, leaving the market open to ease manipulation. You have very low liquidity, domestic foreign exchange markets. Size revenue means the agent in foreign exchange can exert high levels of market power, manipulate prices. Central bankers tended to be defensive, little capacity plan to hit foreign exchange, heavy reliance and focus on accumulating foreign exchange with upward pressures on markets. All countries have a tendency towards greater trade and financial globalization. Listen to the same middle class of the global pyramid classes. No countries, this is so fundamental. No countries accepted other African currencies in a financial debt. It meant that all of your transactions with other African countries is through the dollar market, which is insane. And so it led then to greater pressures to accumulate higher currencies without a mechanism of regional balance and settlement. And so the evidence basically was in interviews with 6 African countries. They're taught the same crap that you're taught in economics. Basically, no attempts to challenge the neoliberal strategies to understand what's underlying the system, in part due to the institutionalization of neoclassical economics on the continent, something I wrote about the 2021 market, something related to Deacon McConaughey. Always did work way before I did it. I always recommend reading his material. In 2014, also pointed to signal. But still, there is some emerging hope now. And I want to come now very quickly to a system called the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System, which is now in the evolutionary process. By November 22 and 25, each of the central banks, each of the commercial banks, I signed up the system, the aim of operationalizing by the end of 2025. The system now relies on instant payment, funding, and net settlement. Originator purchasing items to another country, issuing payment instructions to the bank in their home country to be sent to PAPS, the checks in out forwards to the receiving bank, that clears the funds to the recipient. The system requires pre-funding, and participants need settlement accounts with a real-time gross settlement system for central banks, which should act as leaders. So the idea is we have the potential here for a new system which will allow the utilization of domestic currencies. We don't know what will happen in practice, but it is a step forward in our thinking of reorganizing the monetary system and moving away from a dollar hegemony. So let me close. Okay, so inter-African trade is currently over 16%, and multipolarity needs to be conceptualized beyond the sphere by sphere, focusing about the interaction between the spheres. And so, in my view, African countries need to be thinking about a common institution that can put in place industrial policy encouraging new forms of value chain, manufacturing, with new forms of financial systems that move away from Jala Head. And so we wrote a paper with Mike Alabosi on the creation of African Bank, which will do something of that nature. But perhaps this moment is a moment to take advantage of. Perhaps the Trump tariffs can be seen as a wake-up call to counter the hegemonic forces of the status quo. Perhaps to move towards a new multipolar system that can meet existential challenges on the continent. That's about
Thank you very much for this great presentation, where you can tell us where Africa stands with transparent financial flows and dollar hegemony. So for question about
No, no, sit, you can take it. No, take it.
yeah, only 4 minutes. More weight on it, but thank you very much for the recommendations. So, with any questions, suggestions? Anyone?
Bonjour à tous. Merci pour cette belle intervention. Bon, il y a quelques mois dans le passé, on a assisté à une guerre commerciale entre deux géants économiques, à savoir la Chine et les États-Unis. Donald Trump avait franchi la limite en imposant des droits de douane à hauteur de 145. Et Pékin aussi avait répliqué à sa manière. En de pareilles circonstances, c'est-à-dire dans un contexte où deux géants s'affrontent, ma question est quelle devrait être la posture de l'Afrique ou la stratégie de l'Afrique pour tirer son épingle du jeu? Merci.
Music, few questions before.
Bonjour, professeur. Donc, merci aussi pour cette magnifique présentation donc enrichissante. J'aimerais poser donc une question parce que la première, donc, mon solliciteur m'a déjà posé. Donc, c'était en rapport avec la guerre contre Fili. Donc, la question est la suivante. Donc, comment la domination du dollar dans le système financier international contribue-t-elle à la subordination économique des pays en développement? Et quelle alternative pourrait réduire cette dépendance?
Merci beaucoup, question.
Bonsoir à tout le monde. Alors, la question revient au nom de notre planète. C'était un rapport avec les taxes douanières entre les États-Unis et la Chine. Et l'Afrique aussi occupe une place importante dans cette guerre commerciale. Et récemment, on a assisté les tarifs douaniers les tarifs sur les visas imposés par les États-Unis aux Maliens. C'est-à-dire que le Malien doit fournir à la hauteur de 5 000 à
technology. You have to have full ownership in the companies that are put in place. They put these demands, which are not the demands that need to be put on Chinese companies, on Chinese investors, on Chinese lending. This is what has to change. So as we've argued, it's okay to attract FDI, but you need to push in this opportunity and say, okay, what are you gonna provide to lean more towards yourself? About actually putting in manufacturing investment. If we wanna build up green energy, that's fine. We're very happy to use turbine for wind and to use solar energy panels from China, but you have to set up local manufacturing. That's what actually China did. You want access to the market, you've got to set up local manufacturing. So this is a moment in which the African countries should be operating and use one power or the other to put demands on those powers for improvement. You know, to use that competition to actually change the nature of these policies. It leads to the issue of alternatives to the dollar. I mean, I have a lot of trouble with Bitcoin and these other currencies which are artificial. In some ways, it's not the electronic currencies that are important. It's the setting of some other form of the currency, whether it's electronic or otherwise. And that has to occur by institutional transformation. That's to occur because governments are accepting other African countries' currencies. It has to occur because you're finding mechanisms in which you work in a coordinated fashion to be able to provide buffers for African countries to undertake capital inflows. One of the things we suggested in the paper that Michael and I wrote on the African Green Bank is we suggested a system by which you take the hundreds of billions of dollars that are promised for dealing with climate change in Africa, and you use it to create a new bank. You use that as a basis of reserves, and then use that as a basis to actually do foreign borrowing and make that currency available for manufacturing enterprises inside of African countries in a coordinated fashion. You get the brightest and the smartest. One of the things that Taiwan did. Taiwan set up the equivalent of basically an extension system that's used in agriculture for manufacturing. They lent their top engineers to all the manufacturing companies being set up in Taiwan to assist them in the manufacturing process. The same thing should be done at the centralized level in African countries. Get the brightest minds, give them good jobs, track them back, and then have them service for the continent. So you can set up and utilize a base in some senses like the World Bank did. The World Bank, did have a capital base, but it got access to international loans, and it basically then set up a system in which it then relent at lower interest rates to countries at the same time, talking particularly what they had to pay for money when they didn't do lending. The same thing can be done within the African continent, in which you then would allow, as you build up the capital base, you allow and if a central bank in Africa is able to take the currencies for purposes of means of payment from one country to the next, you build up increasing the currency reserves on the continent, and you then act as a buffer and allow countries to borrow through that bank to access international goods for capital and pay back in their local currencies. So you have to begin to have a mechanism that sets up, and the key really is setting up and allowing for the acceptance through the banking mechanism of other African country currencies. This is central, begin to change things. And so it means getting out of the mindset. If you look at the history of central bankers in African countries, inevitably in the early stages, they used to invite these central bankers to spend time in the IMF, to inculcate them into the thinking of the IMF. This is what you have to do. You're in this kind of neoliberal world, and that gets reproduced. And this is what has to change. And so it's a matter of thinking outside the box, whether it's an electric car, a unique currency, done basically through the internet, through electronics, or whether it's some other kind of currency that's making a difference. It's the utilization and anointment of those currencies as a mechanism of the various functions of money on the continent becomes important. Begin the alternatives, and eventually maybe perhaps even getting some kind of African-wide currency system and some kind of general currency. You know, originally, the IMF was supposed to be creating, was heavily pushed by Keynes, was to set up a new international currency system, the bank wars, which would have avoided the enormous empowerment of the dollar, which was put in place by the US. Again, something similar needs to be put in place eventually within the concept to build up your own financial system. And as I think as other speakers have told you, finding new mechanisms to generate internal debt, pay back with internal debt to avoid the vagaries of international currencies and the dollar projected trust.
Thank you very much, Professor. So please give him again a round of applause. Okay, so we will have a short break before coming for the last panel discussion. Yes, we can make it 10 to 15 minutes. You go ahead.
Yes, also so much.
Ay sama xarit su ma jëndee ginaar may la ko yow moom mooy yow bi di dekk léegi bu la fekkoon sax day kii ak ñàkkal bi ngeen toll leen fuy ngeen torop gaaw ngeen fuy ah
And that's what I'm very good at, you know. Sharing about. And you know, the ability, and one of the things that the subsidies is you know, great conditions. And so one of these two areas also, so if you're gonna set up the manufacturing. That is. I know that you see more units. We have the. We have the. Using the whole thing, you know, do something. And they said that we're here for X amount of company, kind of company. And that's how it became one of the biggest. How old is that? I don't know what that is. They became one of the big manufacturers. Of the HDs, that was some of them. And all this stuff is what I was kind of as if about them. Not they, I was on them. You guys said we trade by the master funds. You don't need to put everything together, it's better than
Can you put my presentation on, let me review. In education technology, you have to know that the thing is ready before.
Really?
And to see that everything is there before you shoot up another presentation. And then we are fighting. So I can control it from the PC already.
Yes, the thing is with you right here.
No problem. First, we do it.
No, not, you can't do it from that machine.
But if we manufacture.
What do you say?
You can't do it from that machine. He was doing it from here.
Ah, from this machine?
Yes, he was having this thing. He's having this thing. What do you call it?
An iPad.
I click our.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, that's what it was.
Oh, okay, that. Okay, so then let me take the point.
So the point, I did point out the photo. I don't know the photo anymore. I borrowed a very short video. So part of it is, you got to. You know, but it's important for the. You know, and how to put the law, find, you know, they have the dominance of the economies. Government should be choosing other stupid. Something else, if you know, and understanding what they has no. So, what I'd argue, actually, was like, you have the moment that. You want to check one. And most, the problem I think that folks. The biggest problem. It's that I get a lot of. Have we been making coaching, we go to the gas and we And what we decided is, so you had like 95% of the population how do you know anything about it? Why is always the same? That's a certain you know, and you have this increase with you know, so you have to set up the mechanism of water and the smoke. And this is so the so this is you have this extra back. We said you set up the solar system, access to water, storm water. And then you have them spending so much water in box. Sunshine, it's not possible. But that means putting in place investment. And you should be then setting up new irrigation systems. Which all of us feel so and then you and maybe it's just independent, you know, who wants to buy it. So you know, because sitting in the bank is doing you might allow for this internal separate things. But we put involved at the same time providing the incentives to the market. No harm is the manufacturer. There are always other stabilizing and building out just feeding things to the existing structure. And that's what ideology is. That's mainstream economic theories and it feeds and maintains a status quo without you know, so and it touched I mean, yeah, okay, I'm not I would develop the economy, obviously, but I say it would be you think that the hallucination is a long application. It's the same thing, so you know, I teach a lot of undergraduate want to come from the courses and be held. And I verified if you didn't talk. I always ask you, I'm sorry, am I misrepresenting what you're doing? I'm sorry, not one set they say, that's the problem is reading. And this is what we're about. It's what they're going to solve, opening up people mind, policy. Gives you the tool which the challenge is set, so in my side of the box, the execution. That's it, it's not good, it's going to be better than what you can talk about as well, because you can hold this. Differently seems. Well, no, yeah, no, they're those focus. They're in a tiny little box. The box is not. It's kind of like you're in physics, right? And you never get beyond the Newtonian laws. No such thing as quantum physics. You don't learn about that. It's a very discriminatory process, but I think it's more so I was international centers. It's just a possibility. People like myself who speak of the democracy. Yeah, I gave a 1999. Central bank. There was a morning breakfast meeting between the organization. I used to send election by the United States information. And used to meet You know, and I was talking, I did it in Africa, and it was a riot because the league was Eastern. And the next day, everyone else was listening to that, person would say, why is, because you might say sitting us, and he wrote and said, you know, if we just satisfy Jeffrey Saxon's like a heavy hill control, we don't have about this, he would just come in here, why are you bringing Jeffrey Saxon saying they should just follow down and get a little list, maybe big sign and say, you're crazy, each let's say, stop.
I cannot open the attachment. Better you just send it by attachment, not by link. I don't know. Maybe the internet is so slow.
Yeah. Myself, even when I opened
The photo is not even. Oh, I'll do it in the room then. Don't worry.
yeah. No, I can also.
In the room, better in my room.
Perfect. Yeah, it's not.
Tonight.
Yes, you can do it.
I had him back in the lecture and watched the meetings and stuff. Hi. How you doing? Embarrassing, you know, always using this, I always said that home. You look at the city organization. The cities of eight, all last time. Being 550. We also mentioned. Talking about being selected in organization, actually, every county and they're all being based. So what you do is you'll be utilizing the areas to provide periods. You know, and so getting up with sufficient size. Build economies of scale, and then you take the debt. And then you move into the next industry. So you see a series of utilization of parrots or multiple decades to create, you know, there's always this argument. I had a lot of so that they all argue, very small it was export program. That's what shit. What they did is they always had input substitution. So they always did was not so they say they want to build up pyramid protection in meeting us for 5 years. A lot of these industries are behind you. I'm sure that the money is already invested. My side, you know, a lot of nonsense. That probably profits, so stop bypass this news. Let's see how it can make money on the auction. I bet you go pressure. And build up the and then move on to it. So you see the series that we need. Intermediate. You have to be different. That's heavy industry. Lighter industry. I mean, this is very much fun. You see the systematic affirmation and helping this. You use in a comparatively short period of time. Yeah, so I've always 3 years and maybe arguing that the students sitting to is put on the and never take it. The other 8 students, yeah, and then they're sorry you do this. Can't do that. This is what now he's arguing about this with how many times you Again, what is say? Wealth, you know, we have this wealth, negative wealth for the population. Oh, we certainly because so that's yeah. So you have this, yeah. Well, now there's already known and they're out, and they do much better than we all. I'm using much. I work very out there to see. I can't say anything obviously. That's why we have. He's only huge trying on the so you said, say, I was here thinking about and then he wanted it to my head. I said, why do you think you feel that sort of you like shoot next to it? It's trouble showing up. I've always said, And how are you? Good.
One that we are using here. But
Sorry?
wait, no, this one, this works. This works. What is this? We can bring the PC to me. So that I can manage it. This works. I tried it. Let me try to see what is the problem here.
Let me. You need the PC here. What I'll do is I'll give him this PC. This. I'll give him this. I'll give him this.
Can you click this?
Or this one. It seems he made some changes. It seems he made some changes.
That professor wants to go back.
He wants to
Howard,
go.
Howard.
Howard.
No,
Okay.
no.
Oh. Okay, you can. It seems you made some changes to what, or that wasn't changes we were doing.
No, it's just a slight thing. Did you think I can?
No, I didn't copy what is here. I just
Okay, then
download.
give it to me now. I can do that.
So you do the changes before we
It's just one simple change.
I know. That's Heterodox, yeah. Yeah, it's working.
It works?
Yeah, it works. Very good.
This is on, right?
Yeah, it's on. But you can use this one.
So you can turn that on. Okay.
We're getting started.
My mother taught me.
Oh, it goes off.
Yes, yes. This time, so if you set in the camera to this place, say,
Yeah.
Yeah, he's asking if you or fine either way. Okay. You can stop. Yeah, I just walk over in the website because it's free, like here.
C'est bon.
C'est bon. Je sens like a point.
Wait up front.
All right, so thank you again for speaking with us. So for last but not least, we will be having Dr. Isaac Abotebuno Akolgo, who is a research and program manager at IDEAS. So he previously worked as a research associate and postdoc at the University of Beirut and Bard College Berlin, respectively. His research, which focuses on money, finance, and the political economy of development in Africa, is published in leading journals, including Development and Change, the Review of International Political Economy, and the Review of African Political Economy. So please help us welcome Professor Abote. Professor, you have 1 hour and then 30 minutes for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Mariam. 1 hour is a lot of time. I usually tend to speak for a shorter period of time. I hate long presentations. This might be my longest presentation, but this would be the shortest you would have in this workshop. I promise you that. So today I will speak. We'll do a lot more political economy. You've done a lot of stock flow analysis, balance sheets. Now let's do a lot more political economy. Coming from Howard's wonderful lecture about multipolarity and the financial system. So I like to talk today about fintech, financial technology. And I would just like to ask, how many of you generally know or have used any fintech of any sort? In simpler terms, fintech is about the application of digital technology to financial services. Have any of you, you can speak, take a mic and let me know if you've used any fintech here in Senegal or you know of anywhere else. Yes, please.
Easy for you to use this, so I can use the mic around. If you could use this.
Anyone would like to talk, Francis? No?
You ask a question.
Someone raised the guy in. Okay, I mean, he can, is that?
Bonsoir, docteur.
Bonsoir.
Donc, on peut faire référence donc, à l'utilisation de la finesse. Donc, on fait référence donc, à l'application web. Donc, c'est l'utilisation de la finesse, mais utilise aussi pour permettre de faciliter les variations. Donc, entre agents, banques, etc. Donc, c'est la finesse qu'ils ont en temps.
I wouldn't let you go. Let me have a short interaction with you, okay? So you talk about wave, right? So what do you make of wave that you use? What do you make about it? What is your opinion about wave as a digital financial service?
Oui, c'est une application très importante donc, pour les Sénégalais parce que beaucoup est utilisable aussi. Donc, de façon, il est construit de façon très simple parce qu'il permet déjà de accessible aussi. Parce qu'il permet de garder notre argent, on va le sécuriser, mais il permet aussi de faire des transferts sans déplacement et de faire des retraits. Voilà, il y a beaucoup de points donc dans les solutions, voilà, dans les solutions aussi. Donc, ils ont développé donc, dans nos applications. Donc, les coffres forts qui permettent de garder de l'argent, voilà, un mois, 2 mois, tout dépendant de votre besoin. Mais et vraiment, voilà, c'est quelque chose. Et le coût, c'est moins cher aussi. Vraiment, je ne fais pas la publicité, mais voilà, c'est la façon dont je utilise, voilà, c'est vraiment une application. C'est ça.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that's brilliant. I like your response. And I think I agree with you on many of the things you have said. And that's basically what I'd like us to discuss today. We all know about these technologies. And what I'm going to do today, I would say that in 3 parts in my presentation today. In the first part, I'll provide a historical context to the evolution of financial technology, like Wave, which you have talked about, and many others, because there isn't only Wave, there are several others across the continent and perhaps even beyond. In the second part, I will talk about the emergence of financial technology in West Africa, around the rest of the continent, but also beyond it. And then in the last part, I will talk about the implications for policy and for scholarship, particularly for us young scholars. So let's go back to the very beginning of political independence. And I like to set the context and to make it very clear that at independence, we have really several narratives about the post-independence development struggle in Africa. But what has to be set straight as a record is that at independence, every form of development indicators were at their worst. And that there was no source of financing significantly bequeathed to the independence governments, as sometimes has been claimed that maybe the colonialists left some funding. That is not true. And like I also indicated earlier, several indicators, human development, infrastructure, were all degraded. Living standards were at their worst. So at the dawn of independence, most of the independence leaders were very quite clear that the problem did not end with political independence, and that it was crucial not only to have political independence, but to pursue socio-economic development. So Patrice Lumumba made this very famous quote, which you should be able to see from the screen, that political independence has no meaning unless it is accompanied by socio-economic and social development. So, but the agenda to pursue this socio-economic development was going to be possible with some significant funding. But that has been the post-colonial struggle, the struggle to secure enough resources, including finance, to drive the agenda of development that can produce very substantial changes in the economic patterns and in the living standards of the majority of people. In the first decade of independence, Ghana in 1957, later others in the 60s, it was a developmentalist drive. Howard talked about import substitutions because the governments realized, the economies were largely dependent on importation and exportation of primary goods. So the first order of business was to set this structural disorder right, to sort of reverse the structural dependence on imports of finished goods. So in the first decade, this developmentalist attempt really succeeded in many ways. But by the late 70s, we begin to have a sort of financial crisis because many of these countries were relying on revenues from exports to drive the industrialization agenda. But that was not going to be possible because I think Ndongo raised this point yesterday and several others. And I've made this point also elsewhere when I've written about debt in Ghana and across the continent. But today I'm not going to dwell on it, just to say that the countries, most of them ran into financial crisis. And then by the 80s, because of the crisis, the general African crisis, the IMF comes in, the IMF and the World Bank comes in, and we have structural adjustment. The structural adjustment is a set of liberal reforms that they pursued from the 80s up until the 90s, and in some countries, even up until the early 2000s. And one of the key things about structural adjustment was financial liberalization. So unlike what Daniela spoke about, and which I have also written quite recently, where they were using credit policies, there was active government participation, structural adjustment emphasized liberal financial regimes, private sector engagement and dominance provide the financing that was needed for development. So it had moved from a state-led agenda to a very private-oriented, financialized strategy to development. In the 80s, along with this attempt to end poverty through this sort of liberalized order, the World Bank and others drew an inspiration from the Bangladesh entrepreneur who had experimented with what he called microfinance to provide small sort of loans to relatively small scale medium enterprises to do social entrepreneurship. So microfinance was caught by the international development agencies. They spread it across Africa in an attempt to provide financial solutions to the poor's problems. So it was simple that if they provided finance to the poor, then they can do business and then they can work their way out of poverty. The verdict on microfinance across the continent wasn't good. By the late 90s, most of them had been shown to be excessively expensive in terms of the credit that they were providing. The interest rates were high. And there were instances of fraud and general misallocation of credit. So by the turn of the century, when many of the African countries were then sort of running into debt again, and you had the heavily indebted poor countries debt relief programs, there was then the emergence in the early 2000s of a new kind of financial solution, which was financial technologies then began to emerge in early 2000. Particularly, it began with the M-Pesa in Kenya, which relied on mobile technology to sort of provide financial services for most people who were relatively unbanked. And unbanked here, I mean people who did not have a traditional bank account. So the premiering M-Pesa role in Kenya did not end there. Several years or later, it spread across the continent. You have Wave here in Senegal. There was MTN Mobile Money in Ghana and Vodafone Cash. There was Orange Money in Cote d'Ivoire and several other countries. So this dominant kind of fintech, mobile money, spread significantly across the continent. And the global agenda around fintech was quite a very simple one. The claims by the G20, the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and a host of other multinational international agencies rallied around fintech after M-Pesa's launch and its relative success to drive what they called a sort of fintech-led development. And fintech-led development made a bold claim, and its claim was that financial inclusion, that is to give access to people who did not have access to the financial system, was the key to solving the development problem. They made basically several claims. I summarized them in three. And the first was a conceptual claim that financial inclusion was the way out of poverty. That if you gave people access to the financial system, theoretically, they would have access to finance, they would have credit, they would be able to transact they can then engage in social entrepreneurship and fight their way out of poverty. The second claim was a policy claim that in historical terms, the traditional banks had failed. Microfinance, which was supposed to bring the unbanked into the financial system, had also collapsed. However, technology, i.e., financial technology, was the quickest way to financially include the unbanked population. The third claim was an evidential claim. So we had some scholars in MIT who did a study on Kenya, nearly a decade after the launch of M-Pesa. And they studied M-Pesa's rollout and made a very bold claim that because of access to mobile money, about 194,000 households in Kenya had been lifted out of poverty. And this bold claim was caught by many of these institutions. It was propagated. And the evidential claim was that because of the access to mobile money, people were able to then fight their way out of poverty. Now, I sort of tried to look at this in my previous work to separate the facts from the rest of the story. What are the facts in the spread of mobile money? We've talked about Wave, we talked about MTN mobile money, we know of the Premier M-Pesa. And I agree with you, my very good friend, that it is easy to transact and maybe to save. It is more accessible than traditional banking systems. But now we have to separate the facts from the rest of the story. What are the facts about the financial technology rollout in Africa? I'm sorry, I realize now that the screen isn't very visible. On my computer, it is very clear, and I should have factored that in. But the facts are quite simple. The facts are that, indeed, and it is visible to everybody, that mobile money and other forms of financial technologies have spread widely across the continent. The growth has been tremendous, and that is not deniable. We have over 178 services across the continent. We have transaction values that go beyond trillions cumulatively. And there are several services across the continent, in East Africa particularly, but also in West Africa. So even for the West Africa region alone, for 2024, the GSMA report, State of the Industry report, showed that about the mobile money transactions were for the year beyond $400 million. Sorry, actually 22 billion in terms of transaction, but also more than 400 million sort of mobile money accounts have been held by subscribers. It is the same for other parts of the continent, but not so the case of East and West Africa. The other fact also is that it's helped to drive the access to transaction accounts. So when you look at, for example, in Senegal, in 2011, less than 10% of the population had access to a financial transaction account, be it a traditional bank or other digital financial service. With the emergence of and the spread of financial technology, we now have in 2024, at the end of 2024, nearly 80% of the population have access to at least a transaction account. So these are the facts, and they are not deniable. I've already talked to you about the Senegalese case, which I want to highlight here again, that you see that there's a tremendous rise in terms of the penetration of mobile money transactions, and therefore people's access to financial services. So that is not deniable. The other factors or other issues, claims, they are not facts. Of course, I'm not discounting research, but there have been several critiques of that famous paper that claimed that 194,000 households had been lifted out of poverty, because we could not point out exactly the source of the emergence from the poverty levels. It might, after all, have been other factors other than the fact that they had access to an M-Pesa account. And perhaps maybe to even have access to an M-Pesa account, one has to have income, some level of money to transact. So you don't necessarily become rich. But of course, I wouldn't go ahead of myself. These are other claims which I wouldn't classify as a facts. We also have, for example, in the Senegalese case, the GSMA report talks about its contribution to GDP. They are all estimates. They are not estimates necessarily based on previous data, but based on the simulations of how much potentially mobile money could have contributed. These I wouldn't classify as the facts. Beyond the facts, then, I think we should shift our focus to the concerns. So I did agree with you that most of the claims you made, and of course, which I've highlighted here, are indeed factual. But what are the concerns? It is not all good news. No, there's more to the story than the facts we have looked at. The first is the issue of the gender gaps in terms of the spread of financial technologies. And this is particularly very important because it's sort of reproducing already existing disparities in terms of access to opportunities, but also access to other services. So apart from Kenya, which relatively does well in terms of the gender parity regarding access to digital financial services, most of the other African countries isn't posting any really good figures. You would observe, I hope for Senegal, not very clear from the screen, I apologize again, but there's a huge difference between women's access to mobile money and that of men. So for example, in terms of mobile money account ownership, about 91% of those accounts are owned by men and or people who identify as male. And only 71%, about 74% for women. Sorry, 74% of women have access to a mobile money account, and about 91% of men have access to a mobile money account. It is the same for many other countries like Nigeria. Ethiopia is much more pronounced in terms of the inequality, and Uganda as well. There's also the issue of rising costs. So like my friend made the point earlier, one of the admirable things about fintech was that it promised lower transaction costs. And it was cheap to transact, unlike in traditional financial services. That was the story from the very beginning, but it doesn't seem to be the case with multiple charges now being introduced, because I see it more as an attempt to enter the market and to dominate. And once most financial services had access to the market and many people were hooked to mobile money, a whole bunch of transaction fees were introduced and or increased. So we then have cumulatively a significant buildup of cost of transactions for mobile money, even if they appear initially to be very minimal. If you accumulate it, you would realize you are indeed paying a very hefty price. And many people are in fact making moves back to traditional bank accounts sometimes to avoid these sort of fees. Like I told you, I did some work on Ghana in this relation to this factor, and it was published in the Review of International Political Economy. I talked about the contradictions of the fintech boom in Africa. And one of the things that I looked at was this transaction cost. And as you would see from the table that for particular mobile money service like MTN, customers were initially introduced to sort of smaller transaction fees, especially with lower transaction amounts. But as the transaction amounts increased, so did the transaction fees. And that was one of the things that over time, people then began to sort of navigate to avoid the transaction costs, which were then becoming a burden, as opposed to the initial claims that it was offering cheaper transaction fees. Not all mobile money services or fintechs do charge significantly. So at least in Ghana, Vodafone offered free transfers to other Vodafone users. So perhaps it is not, but a majority of the fintechs do charge, and the charge is progressive and punitive as more is transacted. The other issue, the concern about the fintech rollout is that of taxes. So most government, constrained by public financing issues, began to resort to digital financial services because it was the easier way to access revenues through taxes. And there have been debates about taxes. I share in those opinions. I do not think that taxes, except for taxes on foreign investments and others, I don't think domestic tax is a way to raise revenue for development. It may be a redistributive tool, but not. So I'm just sharing with the previous presentations that have made this point. But in any case, many governments began to impose significant taxes on electronic financial services. In Kenya, in Uganda, but also in Ghana. And there are, in fact, discussions in Senegal. I'm not sure whether it's been implemented about a tax on mobile money. So, and yes, so it's a widespread issue. In the Ghanaian case, at least the new government has repealed that law. So I should let that be noted. But this paper was done in 2023, before the current government took office. So yeah, for the Ghanaian case, I showed that the imposition of the tax sort of compounded the transaction cost. So initially, if a customer was to sort of transfer 200 cedis, then the equivalent of maybe, or even perhaps now the equivalent of about $20, they initially was going to pay a charge of 2 Ghana cedis. But with the imposition of that tax, which was initially 1.5%, they then had to pay 3.5 Ghana cedis. It was same, especially as they increased the transaction. So it is a case for many other countries where governments began to impose taxes and then sort of raise the transaction fees for access to digital financial services. So for me, that was a serious concern, and across countries that we have to look at. The other more important concern for me in terms of the fintech rollout is the question of financial subordination. So how in the last point that Howard made, he talked about a sort of subordination of already disadvantaged countries in the international financial system. So and how does this work? Because once countries sort of have access to mobile money, what we do not usually think about is the ownership. So I don't know how many of you know the real owners of Wave. You have any idea who owns Wave and where they come from and where the money goes? I mean, anyway, so I leave that to you to figure out. Yeah, as Senegalese, but for most of these services, they are certainly not Senegalese. Sorry, yes, you wanted to respond to that. Do you want to respond to that? Yes, so I was asking the owners of Wave, the fintech that you talked about. And do you have any idea the owners? Yeah, I saw somewhere that the CEOs, some 2 guys, they don't look like me and you. So I'm not suggesting that every Senegalese must look like me and you, but I do want to believe. Yes, please tell me.
D'accord, je vais essayer de répondre à la question que vous m'avez posée. Si je ne me trompe pas, ce sont les Américains, voilà, qui ont créé Donc, les avoir.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for, I trust your judgment and I do believe that, yes. And I looked that up, yes. So it's not just Wave, it's several other fintechs. So in your case in Senegal here, it is actually an easy thing to identify the owners. In the case of other fintechs, the citizens may not even know because you have sort of let me put it in a loosely, representative owners, who are not necessarily the beneficiary owners. So I give an example of MTN mobile money in Ghana. When you look at MTN mobile money in Ghana, about 85% or so is owned by MTN South Africa. Okay, then you say maybe our fellow African brothers own it at least. That is good news. Who owns MTN South Africa? And you look at MTN South Africa and the real investors into MTN South Africa, JP Morgan, you talk about Goldman Sachs, you talk about the largest bank. So ultimately, the beneficiary owners, the institutional investors, are foreign, European, Euro-American interest. So for me, the bigger concern about the fintech rollout, I agree it is good. I do not want the situation where you have to pass money to somebody to take to your family in the village. It is good that you can send it straight to them. But we have a bigger issue, which is reproducing a sort of foreign dominance and control, which most of the early independence leaders had talked and warned us against this sort of financial subordination of our countries. So that has to be an issue that has arisen beyond the facts of the tremendous rise and the ease of access. So I already mentioned some of these institutions. They have investment, not all of them, but most of them, BlackRock and the others. They do have significant investments into most of these financial services, digital financial services that we have. And the fear then is that once they control the financial system, not only do they extract so much from the economy, they also have a say ultimately in terms of political economy as to your policy. The same way that you can be controlled via the IMF once you have taken a loan. Because in many countries, they can't simply threaten to withdraw the capital, and that is not good news. I will look at the third and last part of my talk, and I hope I haven't spent too much time beyond what I've been allocated. Yeah, and the last part I will look at, what are the policy implications? Okay, I should have highlighted also, not here though, the other concern for me is the issue of rising indebtedness. And at least in Kenya, there were a lot of fintechs that were lending money to people and sort of got them indebted privately. It is the same in Ghana as well. A lot of people are indebted who access mobile money loans. And that is another concern that we have to think about. Now let's focus on the last part. What are the implications? And I'll be very brief about this. For research, but also for policy. Generally, it's about regulation and reform. I would make a case for better regulation and reform. We need, but that also means a rethinking of economic and financial policy. And I'm building on the previous conversations that have come before this, but also on my own previous work, which is largely argued for regulation in terms of the financial sectors. And the first part is about pricing. Perhaps maybe the problem is not so huge in Senegal, but in Ghana, I think many people are concerned about the cost of transactions, and that sometimes it is a little arbitrary because customers are not able to tell what constitutes, what is the cost buildup emerging from. So there needs to be some level of regulation about the pricing of digital financial services. That is not to suggest dictating price necessarily to operators, but something consistent with the cost buildup. The second part for digital microloans is that of the interest rate charges, because sometimes the interest rates are not aligned with the central bank's monetary policy rate. And I think going forward in terms of avoiding sort of the indebtedness that most users of fintech have gotten themselves into, there needs to be some level of regulation. First of all, in conjunction with avoiding inflation targeting and not necessarily raising the policy rates, and then also to compel the fintechs to sort of align their interest rates with the central bank's policy rate. The other thing, which for me is more important, is the reframing of fintech. And I need to make the point that this is all an attempt to address the question of poverty and low living standards. But then what is the key thing to addressing the poverty? Just giving someone access to the financial system is not the way out of poverty necessarily, though I think that access to the financial services is good. The real thing is to provide decent jobs. Because if you have M-Pesa or you have Wave, you need money to transact. The fact that you have a Wave account does not necessarily produce money from which you can transfer to your friends and to your loved ones. Then we go back to the real economy. That is where you have to frame fintech just as finance that should accompany a form of productive activity. And that is where we need to address the key source of the developmental problem. And that if at all there's finance circulating, that finance has to be directed to more productive activities, agriculture, into manufacturing, and that could spearhead sort of productive activity and more decent jobs. So broadly for me, these are the concerns. Perhaps there are others we can talk about and you might raise them. I promised you it will be a short presentation. It's longer than I promised. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Awobi, for this great presentation. So you walked us through the claims, the facts, the concerns, but also the implication of fintech in Africa. And it's very interesting when you talk about the rising cost of transaction and maybe potential way for monopoly. It reminds me the story of Uber and Lyft and other. So they want to get rid of those taxi drivers, taxi system, and then slowly installing monopoly, at least in their plans. So yes, very interesting. Questions? Okay.
Hello, really appreciate the intervention. It was really interesting. I just wanted you to highlight the point when you were talking about the tax on foreign investment against tax on domestic revenues. You were talking about it would be better if we could tax more the foreign investments than taxing domestic revenues. To my mind, I think that when you tax foreign investments, you can decrease the amount of money that we could have from this foreign investment, because our nations that we have a lot of, we're not investing in the primary sector. Then a lot of our economies depends on the services, and also the foreign investments is not done or oriented in the primary sector, but in the services. So if you are taxing foreign investment, you are decreasing the amount of money that should come. And by the other way also, when you tax also domestic revenues, we are, as I said a while ago, we have an informal economy, or mostly of our economy depend on the informal sector. Then those people, they use the fintech in order to send, for example, the daily money that they could use at their house. Then they're not using it as a bank account, but they use it in order to have some transactions between them and their families, between them and their children or whatever. Then if you tax them, you are not helping them to really reinforce their purchasing power. And then it could be at the end, being a burden for them using this fintech. And at the end, for the very first time, the idea of fintech is to help people to have an easy life. And by doing taxes or whatever, or foreign investment or domestic revenue, you are just decreasing the purchasing power, whether in the terms of macroeconomic or in the microeconomic in the household's daily life. Thank you. Other questions, suggestions? Yes. Bonsoir à tous. Je vous remercie, docteur, pour cette brève présentation. Je vais d'abord donc me présenter. Je me présente au nom de l'UNI. Je suis étudiant en master en économie et finances quantitatives à l'université Cheikh Anta Diop, Dakar. Ma question sera donc un peu orientée dans le domaine de la finance, surtout les cambistes, car je crois qu'aujourd'hui, avec le développement de la fintech, certains emplois pourraient être menacés, pour ne pas dire écartés dans l'avenir. Par exemple, les cambistes dont l'activité était destinée à effectuer des opérations de change sur le marché financier. Pour les banques, les institutions financières ou même des clients particuliers. Ma question donc est de savoir, face à l'émergence de la fintech, quel serait l'avenir des cambistes? Merci.
Bonsoir. Je suis très ravi de vos présentations parce que ça nous enseigne beaucoup de choses sur les fintechs, plus particulièrement le fait qu'ils nous facilitent les moyens de paiement, surtout dans les zones qui sont beaucoup plus en retard. Il y a certaines personnes qui n'ont pas accès aux banques traditionnelles, donc comme les comptes bancaires. Et je pense que l'arrivée de ces fintechs-là ont facilité les transactions, notamment Wave, Orange Money, comme vous l'avez si bien dit. Comme par exemple aussi, dans les années 2021, on a enregistré une note progrès du taux d'inclusion financière dans certains pays africains, notamment dans l'espace mois, comme le Sénégal, la Côte d'Ivoire. Je pense que ce sont les bonnes choses de l'innovation financière en tant que telle. Alors, malgré les avantages qu'on note au niveau de cette arrivée de digitalisation de la monnaie, on note aussi des limites parce que le Ghana, la majeure partie de la population n'ont pas accès à l'Internet, sont peine à se bénéficier de ces fintechs-là. Et ma question, c'est vis-à-vis de votre présentation. Quelles recommandations donneriez-vous à ces pays qui n'ont pas du tout accès à l'Internet pour qu'ils puissent bénéficier de ces institutions de microfinance? Merci.
Yeah, thank you very much for the wonderful questions. The first on tax on foreign. Okay, so let me clear that I do not mean, for instance, in the case of Wave, which is an FDI here, I don't mean placing a tax on transactions in Wave. The profits of the company should be taxed. That's the point I'm making, and not necessarily the placing a tax to sort of discourage subscribers of Wave and all of that, and also yes. So generally, that was the point I was making. But I do not think. I mean, generally, because you are also making a framing which places FDI on a very significant level beyond what it should be. I think yesterday, Ndongo made this point. I did have that debate with him because I was writing a paper on Ghana's debt, and that sort of helped me to dig deep into some things. And the point he raised again yesterday about Ghana and Zambia, where most of the outflows on FDI in Ghana was higher than we spent in servicing our debt. So, and across, the literature is very significant. You can look it up, read about the fact that FDI is not as good as in your classical thinking would want you to believe. there's no reason to do everything to encourage foreign investments. At least unless in areas where you do not, I mean, I think someone made this point, in sort of technology, I think raised up. In capital investment where you do not have the technology, you can encourage it. So you encourage FDI into areas that are really essential, not into even retail. Why should you encourage foreign direct investments to retail, plantain and yam and other stuff? So yeah, those are generally my views about FDI, that in any case, we should not be encouraging it. But I do not mean the tax on the services. I mean the tax on the profits that are largely repatriated. So that's the point. I hope that sort of helps to respond to that question. And also the question about jobs and the fear that it could lead to loss of jobs in traditional banking systems. I can't speak so much for the Senegalese context. Maybe this could be an opportunity for you to look up and do some further study. But in Ghana and other countries that I at least know, there was an initial tension between the fintechs and the banks, because the fintechs were basically, as my colleague Dr. Mariam Toure talked about. And Mariam, thank you for highlighting the Senegalese point previously. Mariam did help me with some of the data regarding Senegal. And yeah, so there was initially a tension because they were taking over the banks. Nobody was really going to the bank. Everybody was looking to have a mobile money account. But that is basically being resolved structurally. And why do I mean by it's being resolved? There's seamless sort of link between the traditional banking system and the fintechs. So people seamlessly transfer money between their mobile wallets and the banks. So the banks are not necessarily going away anytime soon. I don't think so. And of course, the general thinking that technology may replace jobs is realistic in many ways, but not evidently the case now that I think of. But maybe you have some other perspectives about it. You're welcome to make your point. But I do think that there's a possibility to merge the banking systems, the traditional banking systems, with the digital platforms that currently exist. The other point about the access is limited. Yeah, that's one of the challenges that I did not really raise, which is that connectivity. Many people who live in remote communities across Africa sometimes do not have proper connectivity. So even though they may have money in their wallets or they want to transact, it is not as easy as those who are in the cities and largely urban centers. And that is one of the reforms. And the problem comes from the fact that most of the profits are not reinvested. And it's not just about mobile money, it's also a question about even internet. So you have telecoms that rake in huge profits, but do not invest into the infrastructure to make sure they provide widespread connectivity to their subscribers. But this is where you need government sort of interventions. And when we did have sort of government-owned telecoms, they did far better. And Ethio Telecom in Ethiopia is doing very well, even though it is a state-owned telecom company. So I see opportunities for state ownership in that regard. And then the expansion of the infrastructure. Thank you. But feel free to contribute.
Bonsoir. En fait, moi, j'aurais deux questions. J'aimerais savoir qu'est-ce qui... tout à l'heure, vous aviez dit qu'il y avait un déséquilibre d'accès aux comptes mobiles entre les hommes et les femmes. J'aimerais savoir qu'est-ce qui pourrait expliquer que les hommes aient plus accès aux comptes que les femmes. Et deuxièmement, vous avez dit également que l'accès aux comptes ne garantit pas forcément la sortie de la pauvreté. Donc, est-ce que les fintechs doivent être orientés vers l'épargne, vers l'assurance, vers le microcrédit pour être bénéfiques aux plus pauvres? Merci. Bonsoir, la salle. C'est encore moi, Abby. Bon, ma question est, je suis un peu confuse dans vos propos. Vous nous parlez de la FinTech qui promouvoit l'inclusion financière, alors que, bon, moi, de ce que je sais de Wave, par exemple, ces fonctionnalités consistent seulement à transférer de l'argent ou peut-être garder, il y a un coffre, une fonctionnalité qui est nouvelle, mais il ne prête pas, par exemple, de l'argent aux populations qui l'utilisent. Par exemple, pour Orange, on ne peut pas dire autant parce que eux, ils ont mis récemment une banque, Orange Bank, permet à ses clients d'emprunter de l'argent de 50 à 500 000 selon les transactions du client. Mais on ne peut pas dire pour autant pour Wave et les autres services. Donc, en quoi ces fintech peuvent promouvoir l'inclusion financière s'ils n'accordent pas de crédit aux utilisateurs? Merci.
Bonsoir, monsieur, docteur. Donc, je vais prendre pour le cas du Sénégal, dont il traverse donc, une situation, une crise financière, situation très compliquée, dont le gouvernement a mis en donc de taxer donc, les technologies, donc la monnaie mobile, l'argent mobile, donc 0,5% taxé donc, sur les transferts d'argent plafonné à 2000 et 1,5% de taxes sur les paiements marchands électroniques via mobile, dont le gouvernement a évidence que peut-être ces taxes-là permettront donc au gouvernement peut-être de sortir de cette crise financière. Donc, j'aimerais vous poser la question à savoir, donc, quel rôle peut-il jouer, donc les technologies financières FinEx peuvent-elles jouer pour aider les pays en situation de crise financière?
One or two more questions.
Bonjour à tous. Alors, tout à l'heure, lors de votre présentation, vous avez parlé des inégalités de genre en prenant l'exemple du Kenya. Je voudrais savoir quels sont les impacts directs de l'inclusion financière via la technologie sur l'autonomisation économique des femmes en Afrique, notamment au Sénégal, et quelles stratégies peuvent être mises en œuvre pour optimiser ces impacts. Merci.
I'll add one more question to that, if I hold the mic. So you've made a really good point about those who own those mobile money are not really like us. Thanks for raising that point. So I will be just asking if you would be happier if someone like you own a new mobile money and maybe investing those profits into the country. What would be your take on that?
Bonsoir, docteur. On vous remercie pour cette présentation de belle facture. Déjà, j'ai entendu durant votre présentation, vous avez parlé de le problème d'identification de ceux qui sont propriétaires des mobile money en Afrique. Est-ce que cela implique qu'il y a un système d'actionnariat au sein des mobile money exactement? L'autre question, c'est par rapport à l'inclusion financière. Est-ce que les études ont démontré qu'en fait, ces mobile money-là aident quand même à améliorer cette inclusion financière en Afrique, vu que nous avons des pays qui sont un peu bancarisés? Merci.
All right, we'll let you answer those questions.
Thank you for the interest. I didn't think it would provoke such a conversation, but yes, thank you for your wonderful questions. So the first, I think about two questions relating to the gender issue. Yeah, so the question was about what explains the gender disparity. Obviously, there are several factors, but the first goes back to the foundational question that you raised. What is the source of the precarity, the economic precarity? Because for those who advocate financial technology, it is access to financial system, which is financial inclusion. And that with that would also come the ability to do some form of entrepreneurship and to fight a way out of poverty. But the reverse is actually the case, perhaps, that it is those who perhaps have the economic power that are more likely to access financial services, including even mobile money and other fintechs. So, and we know that in our countries, many of the people who do not have access to decent living or jobs are women. So why would they have a mobile money account? And perhaps even lower education levels. And the higher your education, the more likely that you are holding a financial technology or you are using a financial technology. So there are several explanations. So that then actually shoots the initial idea and the claim that because you need, first of all, the right education to understand the technology. You also have to have the money to own a mobile phone. I didn't have the data here for you regarding access to mobile phone, but men still have more access to mobile phone than women across several other African countries. So these are the many factors why we have the disparity. And it is so obvious that for those of you here, you are more likely, everybody would ultimately have a Wave account or something. Others who do not have the education that you have, they are less likely to have it. And then, of course, the capacity to transact. So for me, that would be, and there would be many other things. It is not like they're refusing to register women, but these are the more structural reasons why there are more men who may be holding, having access to those financial services. The other is, does access guarantee, if access doesn't guarantee a way out of poverty, why that is the case? And I think I've already answered that partly in this, that the question that you would do social entrepreneurship, like for example, you would run a small business. If you have access to a transaction account, you still need the money to register a business. And even for those that give credit, so you just talked about Orange. I haven't looked at how much they give, but for those that I know, the amounts are so small that they are not significant enough for you to do any investment in a business. So averagely in Ghana, for instance, you might get, as a first-time borrower, you're not going to get more than 1,000 cedis, which is about $100. But to rent an office space or even a small shop, we are talking about over 2,000, even in the worst places. So that is not enough to even rent a space, not to talk about acquire other things. So you cannot fight your way out of poverty simply because you have a Wave account. In that case, then we wouldn't have a lot of unemployed graduates because they have Wave accounts, MTN mobile money accounts, but they need credit. They need perhaps also better jobs. And credit doesn't necessarily, and even if the fintechs give the credit, like I have indicated, it's not significant. And worst of all, the interests are exploitative. At least in Ghana, you pay about 6.9% for a 30-day loan, which is not even up to $200. So for me, that is the fundamental reason why it cannot be a way out of poverty. What can they do to provide the credit? Okay, so in my new sort of research where I'm thinking about going beyond the critique of fintech to look at real policy solutions, one of the things that I talk about is that in terms of rolling out credit policies that Daniela spoke about today, and I did a paper recently on credit in Ghana. And one of the, not in that paper, but in terms of fintech, I think that part of rolling out the government credit policy, for example, if government wants to sort of do some credit, grant credit to farmers, we know that in many remote areas, people may not have access to a bank account, but they do have access to a mobile money account. So fintech can be the medium through which the government-driven policy can get credit to people. But we should not mistake it to mean that fintech is the access to the resource, but it could be just an instrument to roll out a massive credit policy, even including social benefits where they are paid. So for me, that could be the possibilities. The planned tax on fintech or digital financial services in Senegal. In Ghana, it was resisted quite significantly, but it was still passed because we live in a liberal and like Senegal, a sort of electoral democracy where it is the rule of law, or perhaps, could be something else, maybe. But that is what it is. So unless we will secure enough parliamentarians to vote against the bill, it will be passed and you will pay that tax. So, but of course, that tax should not be imposed. It can be imposed on the profits of Wave and others, I think, rather than on, and the claim that you make that to pay the debt, I mean, that's a question that is debatable. Maybe the domestic debt, yes, because you don't necessarily pay the most of the debt in the local currency unless you have access forex. So it is not always the case that it will help in a way to avoid the debt crisis. I don't think so. How do you address the gender gaps in this? It goes back to the foundational thing. Real opportunities for equitably distributed to all sections of the society. And in many ways, women preferably. So you go back to the fundamentals as I have already indicated. Yes, in terms of ownership, Mariam, thank you. That's a point I did not make, which policy should deliberately support the indigenous ownership. For example, if there are minimum capitals to entering into the market, why can't we lower it for domestic investors? Of course, we can also encourage domestic investors to sort of come together if they do not have the capital. But even if they do, they're still never going to have the muscle, the financial muscle that foreign firms who access cheaper credit in the US and in Europe would have. So that means we have to discriminate in terms of the minimum requirements for entry into the digital financial services sector. Just like the traditional banks, we have to lower the minimum capital requirements for Senegalese and other West African investors into their various. I mean, that's just one of the ways, and the other structural bottlenecks cleared. Yeah, financial inclusion. So financial inclusion sometimes is loosely defined just to mean access. But if you talk about proper inclusion, you should also talk about opportunities to even have a fuller access to all of the financial services. If you don't even have a good job, you're not able to access credit. So for me, generally, it goes back to the foundational question of the real success of the economy, which can provide better jobs. Thank you.
I think there are two more questions. If you want to go, then.
Bonsoir. Je voulais juste poser une petite question. Dans les économies africaines, la création d'emplois, vous l'avez souligné d'ailleurs, les emplois productifs est essentiel pour le développement des pays africains. Par exemple, au Sénégal, si on constate que 95% des actifs sont dans le secteur informel. Mais les données de toute cette masse sont détenues par les mobile money. Vous pensez que dans ce cas précis, le fintech, par exemple, le fintech pourrait jouer un rôle très important dans la mesure où actuellement, presque toute la masse pense que les opérateurs mobiles permettent de jouer le rôle, les transactions sont faciles. En fait, je voulais dire, est-ce que la fintech peut apporter une innovation voilà, sur ça, pour permettre à l'emploi productif?
Okay, the last one.
Ok. Merci de m'avoir donné la parole. J'aimerais poser une question. J'aimerais que vous développiez en parallèle sur l'ensemble des fintech. Voilà, dans un contexte où l'Afrique envisage de nouvelles monnaies. La dépendance de fintech étrangers, dans notre continent, comme les etc., ne constituait pas un danger pour notre souveraineté.
Those final questions.
Yeah, thank you very much for the questions. I mean, the last point, so terms do matter, you know. I did make this point and I should have raised that. I mean, use the term monetary sovereignty when I talked about the foreign influence. And thank you for bringing the right terminology back into the discussions. Yeah, there are serious questions about monetary sovereignty with the foreign control of these digital financial services. However, like you said, in terms of the opportunities that could exist, imagine that Wave was a domestically owned institution. When I say domestically owned, let's say, like you said, there wasn't foreign influence. It could be actually a platform for potentially payments across even the West African region. So because we've been making points about payment systems, how could we avoid the problems with a reliance on a US-based payment system like the SWIFT system? If we had a domestic ownership, one of the ways to do this could have been to use all of these as a sort of payment system so that you could seamlessly pay a Ghanaian for some goods that you were buying from Ghana or something like that. So yes, there's a potential for an erosion of our monetary sovereignty, and it is real, it's significant that these fintechs are owned by foreigners, but it could, if reformed in line with what I propose, which is increasing domestic, national or regional ownership, it could be a catalyst for perhaps much more integrated payment systems. The previous question talked about productive jobs and whether mobile money could be innovative enough. I think, yeah, it can serve innovation, like I said, for payments, but the finance must be directed productively. So just to make a distinction, you have to also distinguish between productive and unproductive credit. Most of the time, the finance that is circulating is sort of speculative and perhaps based on consumption. To have it lead to some form of innovation and productive or decent jobs, you have to push it to the productive sectors of the economy. Agriculture, manufacturing, industry, broadly speaking. So for me, that is the way that it could potentially. But we can have this conversation beyond this session. I don't want to be the one keeping you from your dinner.
Thank you very much. So yeah, we all done for today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, the battle is over. Okay. So I'm done, right? None of this is mine.